After thinking about it a lot, I'm going to tell my story. How I ended up in bed with the carpenter. Just saying that makes my stomach tighten and my cheeks burn. I've turned it over in my mind so many times, convincing myself to just forget it and move on. But here I am, typing away like this might somehow untangle everything. It all started with the kitchen. I'd been living in this house for 10 years, staring at those dated cabinets and cracked countertops every single day. It wasn't just an aesthetic problem. The drawers stuck, the faucet leaked. I'd put it off for so long, always saying there were more important things to spend money on. But one morning, with the sunlight highlighting the peeling laminate, I decided it was time. No more excuses. I spent the next few days scrolling through Instagram, saving pictures of glossy countertops and minimalist backsplashes. I wanted something warm but modern. Not too fancy. Once I had a vision, I started asking around for recommendations. My friend Tina swore by this local carpenter she'd used for her bathroom remodel. He's meticulous, she said, and pretty easy on the eyes, if you care about that sort of thing. I laughed her comment off, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't stick in my head. When I called him, his voice surprised me, deep but not gruff, with a steady confidence that made me feel like I'd made the right choice. "Hi, this is Ian," he said, and I introduced myself, explaining what I needed. He asked a few questions, nothing too technical, and said he could stop by the next day to look at the space. It all felt straightforward, businesslike. I didn't give it a second thought. The next morning, I heard his truck pull up just as I was finishing my coffee. I opened the door and saw him standing there, toolbox in hand, a casual smile on his face. He was, well, Tina hadn't been wrong. Mid-30s, I guessed, with a scruffy beard and broad shoulders that made me feel suddenly self-conscious in my baggy sweater. He wasn't flashy, just a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, but there was something about the way he carried himself, so at ease, like he didn't have to try to be noticed. "Hi, I'm Ian," he said again, shaking my hand. His grip was warm and firm, his palm calloused. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Rachel," I cut in quickly. "Just Rachel." He smiled, nodded, and stepped inside. As he looked around the kitchen, measuring and jotting notes, I found myself watching him more than I should have. His movements were methodical, confident, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. When he glanced back at me to ask a question about the layout, I felt a flicker of something. Curiosity, maybe. Or something I didn't want to name just yet. By the time he left, promising to send me a quote by the end of the week, I felt an odd mix of anticipation and guilt. It was just a renovation, I told myself. Just a guy fixing my kitchen. So why did my chest tighten when I thought about seeing him again? That night, as I stood in the kitchen, I couldn't stop replaying our conversation. The way Ian had leaned against the counter, pointing out how we could maximize the space by shifting the cabinets slightly, his voice steady and assured. I'd nodded along, but honestly, my mind had drifted. There was something magnetic about him, a kind of quiet charisma that made the room feel smaller, warmer. I told myself I was being ridiculous. He was just a carpenter doing his job. And me? I was a 38-year-old mother of 2. The kind of woman who wore yoga pants to the grocery store and forgot to put on mascara half the time. Ian probably met dozens of women every week, some younger, prettier, more put together than me. The thought should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. The next day, Ian sent over the quote. It was fair, detailed, and, most importantly, within my budget. I approved it right away, not bothering to shop around for other options. Something about his professionalism made me trust him completely. He said he'd start the following Monday, and I found myself oddly nervous about it. I busied myself over the weekend, clearing out the kitchen and making room for the inevitable chaos of construction. But there was an underlying hum of anticipation I couldn't shake. When Monday arrived, Ian showed up early, just as I was getting the kids out the door for school. My daughter, Emily, eyed him curiously as she slipped on her backpack. "Is he fixing our kitchen?" she asked, her voice loud enough to make me wince. Ian chuckled softly. "That's the plan," he said, crouching down to her level. "You like pancakes?" Emily nodded solemnly. "Good," he said, glancing back at me with a grin. "Because this kitchen's gonna be perfect for making them when I'm done." I rolled my eyes playfully, shooing the kids out the door. When I came back inside, Ian was already laying down drop cloths, focused on the task at hand. He didn't need much from me that first day, so I hovered awkwardly, trying not to get in his way. Eventually, I settled at the dining table with my laptop, pretending to work but stealing glances whenever I thought he wasn't looking. The way he moved was almost hypnotic, careful but efficient, like he knew exactly how much force to apply with each swing of his hammer. At one point, he caught me watching and raised an eyebrow, a teasing smile playing at his lips. "Everything okay?" he asked. I fumbled for an answer, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. "Yeah, sorry, just trying to stay out of your way," he nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary before he turned back to his work. I stared down at my laptop, my pulse quickening. It was such a small exchange, barely worth noting, but it lingered in my mind all afternoon. By the time Ian packed up for the day, the kitchen already looked different. The old cabinet doors were gone, leaving the room feeling strangely bare but full of potential. As he wiped his hands on a rag, he glanced at me with that same easy smile. "See you tomorrow, Rachel." I smiled back, but inside, I was a mess. His voice, his presence, it was all so normal, so casual, and yet it felt like something had shifted, like an invisible thread had been pulled taut between us. I told myself I was imagining it, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The next few days passed in a blur of sawdust, muted hammering, and the low hum of Ian's portable radio. He worked steadily, keeping his focus on the task, but there was an ease to his presence that made the space feel different. It wasn't the chaos I'd expected from a renovation. It was almost pleasant. I tried to stay busy, telling myself it wasn't polite to hover, but it was impossible not to notice the small things, like the way he hummed along to songs on the radio, his voice rough but oddly soothing, or the way his brow furrowed in concentration as he measured and cut wood. Even the smell of sawdust, mingling with his faint cologne, became something I found myself drawn to. We talked a little more each day. At first it was about the kitchen, the layout, the finishes, the timeline, but then the conversation started drifting. He'd ask me about the kids, and I'd tell him about Emily's love of soccer and how my son Ben was obsessed with dinosaurs. He'd nod, sharing little snippets about his own childhood, his voice softening as he talked about growing up with his brothers. "I used to spend summers helping my dad," he said one afternoon, sanding down a piece of wood. "He was a contractor too. Guess it runs in the family." "Is that how you got into this?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. "Yeah," he said, glancing up at me. "Didn't think I'd stick with it at first, but there's something satisfying about it, you know? Taking something broken and making it whole again." I nodded, feeling a strange pang in my chest. There was something deeply honest about the way he spoke, like he wasn't just talking about cabinets and countertops. I wanted to ask him more, but I stopped myself, afraid of where the conversation might lead. By the end of the week, the kitchen was starting to take shape. The cabinets were in, and Ian had started installing the new countertops. It was exciting to see the progress, but I couldn't deny that a part of me dreaded the project's end. Each day, I looked forward to his arrival, to the steady rhythm of his work and the quiet moments we shared in between. It felt like having someone to confide in, even if we were only skimming the surface. One morning, I offered him a cup of coffee. He hesitated at first, then smiled and accepted it, leaning against the counter as he took a sip. "You don't have to do that, you know," he said. "I'm used to fending for myself on jobs." "I don't mind," I said, shrugging. "It's nice to have someone to make coffee for." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and I immediately regretted it. Ian's eyes flicked to mine, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. He didn't say anything, just nodded and took another sip. The air between us felt heavier after that, charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. It wasn't awkward exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the way his hand had brushed mine when he handed the coffee mug back, his touch lingering just a second too long. It was a small moment, barely worth noticing, but it felt like a spark had been lit, and I had no idea how to put it out. I woke up the next morning feeling restless. The kind of restless where you clean the bathroom sink for no reason or reorganize the pantry just to keep your hands busy. But no matter how much I busied myself, my thoughts kept circling back to Ian. That spark I'd felt when our hands brushed. It was absurd to dwell on something so small, yet it lingered like a song stuck in my head. When he arrived that morning, I found myself hyper-aware of everything. The sound of his boots on the floor, the low rumble of his voice when he greeted me. Even the way he opened his toolbox felt like it carried more weight than it should have. I hated myself for noticing all these things, but I couldn't help it. The tension I felt was subtle, just beneath the surface, but I could tell I wasn't alone in it. There were moments when Ian seemed quieter than usual, his gaze lingering a little longer than necessary when he asked me a question. We'd shared easy banter before, but now there were pauses, moments where the air seemed to thicken between us. It was as if we were both aware of something unspoken, but neither of us dared to name it. That afternoon, as Ian was working on the backsplash, I wandered into the kitchen with a glass of water. I wasn't thirsty, I just needed an excuse to be there. He was crouched by the counter, his back to me, and I couldn't help but notice the way his t-shirt stretched across his shoulders. It was such a simple thing, so ordinary, but my pulse quickened all the same. "You're making this look easy," I said, my voice lighter than I intended. He turned his head, looking up at me with a faint smirk. "That's the goal," he said. "Can't have you regretting hiring me?" I laughed softly, leaning against the door frame. Not a chance. There was a moment of quiet after that, just the sound of his tools and the distant hum of the radio. I wanted to say something else, anything to fill the silence, but nothing came. Instead, I found myself watching the way his hands moved, strong and steady, like they belonged to someone who could fix anything. "I'm glad you called me for this job," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I blinked, caught off guard. "Why's that?" He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Sometimes jobs like this feel transactional, in and out, you know, but this feels different. Like I'm not just fixing a kitchen, I'm helping build something that matters." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Was I reading too much into it? Or was there something more in the way he was looking at me, his eyes softer than I'd ever seen them? Before I could answer, he cleared his throat and looked away. "Anyway," he said, his tone shifting back to business, "I should have this finished by tomorrow. You'll finally get your dream kitchen." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks, Ian. Really." But as he turned back to his work, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd just crossed an invisible line. It wasn't anything obvious. Nothing anyone else would have noticed. But it was there, a tiny crack in the wall I'd built around myself, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't sure if I wanted to patch it up. That evening, after Ian left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the half-finished backsplash. The space already looked so different, brighter, more open. It was everything I'd wanted, but instead of feeling excited, I felt unsettled. I told myself it was just the mess of renovations, the disruption to my routine. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. The truth was, I hadn't felt this alive in years. My marriage to Matt had settled into something that barely resembled what we'd started with. It wasn't bad exactly, just empty. We shared responsibilities, exchanged quick conversations about schedules and bills, but there was no spark, no depth. I couldn't remember the last time he'd touched me like he really saw me or the last time I'd wanted him to. We weren't fighting, we were just existing, side by side, in this silent, unspoken distance. And then Ian walked into my house, and it was like a light switch flipped. Every look, every word, every moment near him felt charged. I didn't even know what I wanted from him, or if I wanted anything at all, but I couldn't deny the pull I felt. It scared me as much as it thrilled me. The next day, Ian arrived as usual, his easy smile disarming me the moment I opened the door. "Morning," he said, brushing past me with his toolbox in hand. His closeness left a trail of warmth in his wake, and I quickly stepped back, pretending to straighten a stack of mail. "Morning," I replied, my voice a little too high. I stayed out of the kitchen for most of the day, retreating to the living room with my laptop, but even from the next room I could hear him, his tools clinking, his footsteps moving back and forth. I couldn't focus on anything, my thoughts constantly drifting back to him. By late afternoon, the noise stopped, and I heard him call out, "Rachel, you around?" I stood, smoothing my shirt as if that would somehow steady my nerves, and walked into the kitchen. He was wiping down the countertops, the backsplash now complete. The soft gray tiles gleamed in the afternoon light, perfectly aligned. It was stunning, and I told him so. "You've got a great eye for design," he said, his voice warm. "Makes my job easier." I laughed softly, feeling a flutter in my chest. "Well, you made it all come together. It's amazing." He leaned against the counter, looking at me for a moment before speaking. "You've got a good energy, you know? Makes this kind of work feel different." I froze, unsure how to respond. My heart pounded in my ears, and I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. "Different how?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Just more personal, I guess. It's nice." The space between us felt too small, the air thick with something unspoken. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, breaking eye contact as I busied myself with rearranging a stack of coasters on the counter. Ian didn't push. He just smiled faintly and said, "I'll be back tomorrow to finish up the trim." As he walked out the door, I leaned against the counter, my hands trembling. I didn't know what I was doing or why I felt this way. All I knew was that I wasn't ready for him to leave, not yet. The next day was supposed to be the final day of the renovation, and I felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. On the one hand, I was excited to see the finished kitchen, to finally have everything back in place, but on the other, I wasn't ready for Ian to leave. I told myself I was being ridiculous. This was just a professional relationship, a transaction, but deep down, I knew it had become more than that, at least for me. Ian arrived mid-morning, his usual relaxed demeanor putting me instantly at ease. "Ready for the big reveal?" he asked with a grin as he stepped inside. "Let's see what you've got," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. He got to work immediately, installing the final pieces of trim and adding finishing touches. I busied myself in the living room, but every now and then I found myself wandering into the kitchen under the guise of checking on something. He'd glance up when I entered, and each time, I felt that same jolt of connection, like an invisible thread pulling me toward him. By mid-afternoon, he was done. The kitchen was complete, and it was beautiful. The warm wood tones of the cabinets, the sleek countertops, the subtle sheen of the backsplash, it all came together perfectly. Ian stood back, hands on his hips, a satisfied look on his face. "Well?" he asked, turning to me. "What do you think?" "It's perfect," I said, my voice soft. "Better than I imagined." He smiled, his eyes meeting mine. "Glad to hear it. It was a good project, and, well, you've been a good client." The way he said it, the slight hesitation in his voice, made my stomach flip. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The air between us was heavy, like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't quite name. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. "Let me get you some water," I said, moving toward the fridge. It was a flimsy excuse to escape the intensity of the moment, but I needed something to ground me. As I handed him the glass, our fingers brushed. It was such a small, innocent touch, but it sent a spark through me. I saw his expression shift, his smile faltering for just a second before he recovered. "Thanks," he said, his voice quieter now. He drank the water and set the glass down on the counter. "Well, I guess that's it," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Unless you need anything else?" The question hung in the air, and I could feel my pulse quicken. There were 100 things I could have said, should have said, but instead, I just shook my head. "No, I think we're all set." He nodded, hesitating for a moment before heading toward the door. "All right then. Take care, Rachel." "You too, Ian," I said, my voice barely steady. As the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The kitchen was finished and Ian was gone. It should have been a moment of relief, but instead, I felt an ache I couldn't quite explain. That night, as I stood in the glow of my beautiful new kitchen, I realized that it wasn't the renovation that had left a mark on me. It was Ian, the way he'd seen me, the way he'd made me feel alive again. And as much as I tried to push those thoughts away, I couldn't, because for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just a wife or a mother. I felt like a woman. The days after Ian finished the kitchen felt emptier than I expected. I had my dream space now. Everything gleamed. Everything worked perfectly. The kids loved it. And Matt even managed to say, "Looks good," which, for him, was practically a glowing review. I should have felt satisfied, but instead, I felt unmoored. It wasn't the kitchen I missed. It was Ian. I tried to throw myself into other things, cleaning up the rest of the house, catching up on emails, even baking cookies just to test out the new oven. But every time I walked into the kitchen, I thought of him, his voice, his laugh, the way his hands moved so confidently as he worked. It was maddening, the way he lingered in my mind without even being here. One afternoon, about a week after he'd left, I found myself scrolling through my phone, looking for his number. I told myself it was innocent. I'd just call to thank him one more time for the great job he'd done. Maybe ask for a recommendation for a painter, something practical. But my finger hovered over the screen, and I couldn't bring myself to press call. I wasn't fooling anyone, least of all myself. That night, Matt came home late from work, exhausted as usual. He ate dinner in silence, scrolling through his phone as I sat across from him. The kids were in the living room, laughing at some cartoon, and the sound of their giggles felt like it belonged to someone else's life. "How was your day?" I asked, hoping for something more than the usual one-word answer. "Fine," he said without looking up. I swallowed hard, staring down at my plate. This was our normal now. Two people living parallel lives, connected by routines and responsibilities, but nothing deeper. I told myself it wasn't his fault, that we'd both let it happen, but that didn't make it any easier to sit across from him and feel invisible. Later, as I cleaned up the kitchen, I heard the kids running upstairs, their footsteps echoing through the house. Matt was already in the den, the sound of the TV muffled behind the closed door. I stood at the sink, staring out the window into the dark backyard. The ache in my chest felt heavier than ever, and for a moment, I wondered if this was just how life was supposed to be. But then I thought about Ian, the way he'd looked at me, like he actually saw me, the way he'd spoken to me, with warmth and interest, like I was someone worth paying attention to. It wasn't fair to compare him to Matt. He wasn't living with me, raising kids, dealing with the daily grind, but still, I couldn't help myself. I missed that feeling, that spark, even if it had been fleeting. The next morning, I finally worked up the courage to text him. Just a simple message. "Hi, Ian. Hope you're doing well. Just wanted to say thanks again for the beautiful work you did on the kitchen. It's perfect." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, my heart pounding in my chest. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with his reply. "Hey, Rachel. Thanks. Glad you're happy with it. Let me know if you need anything else." I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. It was polite, professional, exactly what it should have been. But something about it felt open-ended, like he'd left the door ajar, and I couldn't resist stepping through. Actually, I might. "Do you know anyone who does custom shelving?" I was thinking of adding some in the den. The response came quickly. "Yeah, I can do that. Want me to stop by and take a look?" My breath caught, and I hesitated for only a moment before typing back, "That would be great. When are you free?" When his reply came, "Tomorrow afternoon work?" I knew I was crossing a line, but the truth was, I didn't care, because for the first time in years, I was doing something for myself, and I wasn't ready to let it go. The next afternoon, I waited for Ian like a teenager waiting for a date. I told myself it was silly, that this was just about shelving, but I couldn't shake the flutter of nervous anticipation that had settled in my chest. I'd even put on a little makeup, just enough to look like I hadn't tried too hard. I told myself it was because I'd been feeling frumpy lately, but deep down, I knew the truth. When his truck pulled into the driveway, my heart did a little flip. I opened the door before he had a chance to knock, trying to appear casual. "Hey," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Hey," he replied, his smile warm but restrained. "How's the kitchen treating you?" "Perfect," I said quickly, motioning toward the den. "Let me show you what I was thinking." The den was a cozy space just off the living room, lined with mismatched bookshelves we'd collected over the years. It was functional but cluttered, and I'd been wanting to update it forever. I explained my idea, sleek, built-in shelving that would make the room feel more polished, and Ian listened intently, nodding as I spoke. "You've got a good eye for this stuff," he said, his voice thoughtful as he ran a hand along one of the old shelves. "This'll look great once it's done." "Thanks," I said, my cheeks warming. "I've been meaning to do it for years. But you know how it is. Life gets in the way." He looked at me then, his eyes soft but piercing. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I know how that is." The air between us thickened, and for a moment, I felt like I couldn't breathe. I looked away, pretending to study one of the shelves, but I could feel his gaze lingering on me. It was the same feeling I'd had in the kitchen, like the space between us was charged, buzzing with something unspoken. Ian cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "I'll sketch up a design and get you a quote," he said, his tone shifting back to business. "Shouldn't take more than a few days." "Great," I said, forcing a smile. "Just let me know when you're ready." He nodded, but as he packed up his tools and headed for the door, I felt a pang of disappointment. It had been such a small interaction, just a conversation about shelving, but I'd been hoping for something. I wasn't sure what, exactly, but I knew it wasn't this polite, professional distance. As Ian stepped outside, he turned back to me, his hand on the doorframe. "Rachel." "Yeah?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "Thanks for calling me back," he said, his voice quiet. "It's nice to work with someone who appreciates the details." I blinked, caught off guard. "Of course, you're great at what you do." He smiled, his gaze lingering for just a second longer than necessary. "I'll be in touch." And then he was gone, leaving me standing in the doorway, my chest tight with emotions I couldn't untangle. That night, as I sat in the den with the kids, their laughter filling the room, I couldn't stop replaying the day in my mind. It was such a simple exchange, so mundane on the surface, but underneath, it felt like the beginning of something I wasn't sure I could stop. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The days that followed felt like a waiting game. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a text from Ian about the shelving design. Every buzz of my phone sent my heart racing, but it was never him. I tried to stay busy, throwing myself into errands, work, and the endless task of keeping up with the kids. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept circling back to Ian, his voice, his eyes, the way he'd said, "Thanks for calling me back," like it meant something more. When his message finally came, I felt an immediate rush of relief and excitement. "Hey Rachel, got a design ready for the shelves. Can I swing by tomorrow to show you?" I typed back quickly, trying to keep it casual. "Tomorrow works. What time?" He replied within minutes. "Around 2? I agreed, and then stared at my phone for a long time, my stomach in knots. Tomorrow. I'd see him again tomorrow. The thought filled me with both anticipation and guilt. I wasn't doing anything wrong, at least that's what I kept telling myself, but it didn't stop the guilt from creeping in like a shadow. The next day, I spent the morning tidying up the house, even though Ian probably wouldn't notice if the throw pillows were perfectly fluffed. By the time 2 o'clock rolled around, I was a ball of nerves. When his truck pulled into the driveway, I took a deep breath and forced myself to calm down. "Hey," I said, opening the door as he approached, a roll of blueprints in hand. "Hey," he replied, smiling. "Ready to see what I've got?" I nodded and stepped aside, leading him into the den. He unrolled the blueprints on the coffee table, explaining the design as he pointed to the sketches. The shelving was simple but elegant, with clean lines and just enough detail to make it interesting. It was perfect, exactly what I'd envisioned. "This is amazing," I said, leaning over the table to get a closer look. "You really nailed it." He chuckled softly, and when I glanced up, I realized how close we were. His face was just inches from mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The air felt heavy again, charged with that same unspoken tension I'd felt before. My heart pounded, and I knew I should pull back, create some space between us, but I couldn't. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice low and steady. I froze, my breath catching. The way he said my name, it wasn't just a word, it was a question, an invitation, a warning, all wrapped into one. I didn't know what to say, how to respond, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. "I should, finish going over the details," he said, finally breaking the moment and stepping back slightly. His voice was calm, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way he shifted uncomfortably. "Don't want to leave anything out." "Right," I said quickly, straightening up and forcing a smile. "Of course." He walked me through the rest of the design, his tone professional again, but the energy between us had shifted. There was a heaviness to every word, every glance, like we were both acutely aware of the line we'd almost crossed. When he finished, he rolled up the blueprints and looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Let me know what you think. No rush." "Thanks," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I'll take a look and let you know." He nodded and left, and I stood there for a long time after the door closed, staring at the empty space he'd left behind. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about the way he'd said my name. There was something in his voice that I couldn't shake, something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And for the first time, I let myself wonder what would happen if I stopped fighting it. The next few days passed in a strange haze. I told myself I needed to focus on the shelving, to really think through Ian's design and make sure it was exactly what I wanted. But the truth was, I couldn't stop replaying that moment in the den. The way he'd leaned in, the way he'd said my name, it was like a tiny fracture in the dam I'd built around myself. And now everything I'd been holding back was seeping through. I hadn't realized how long I'd been staring at the blueprints on the kitchen counter until Emily tugged on my sleeve. "Mom, can I have a snack?" "Yes, sweetie, of course." I shook myself out of my trance and grabbed her some crackers, trying to seem normal, but it was hard to concentrate with Ian's voice echoing in my mind. That evening, as Matt scrolled through his phone in the living room, I sat on the couch pretending to watch TV. He didn't notice the way I kept glancing at my phone, waiting for some excuse to message Ian. It wasn't that I wanted to cross a line. It was more like I was drawn to the possibility of it. The thought terrified me, but it thrilled me too. The next morning, I woke up feeling restless. I had no real reason to text Ian. Nothing about the shelving had changed, and I'd already told him I loved the design, but the need to connect with him, even just a little, was overwhelming. I finally gave in, typing out a message before I could overthink it. "Hi, Ian. Just wanted to say the design looks amazing. Can't wait to see it come to life." He responded almost immediately. "Thanks. Glad you like it. When do you want to get started?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I knew this was a practical question, that he wasn't suggesting anything more, but the way my pulse raced as I typed out a response felt anything but practical. "Whenever you're free." "How about tomorrow?" he replied. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Tomorrow. I knew I should have put it off, given myself more time to think, but instead I typed back, "Tomorrow works. See you then." The rest of the day was a blur. I went through the motions of my usual routine, but everything felt charged, like I was waiting for something to happen. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment I'd spent with Ian. The way he looked at me, the way his voice softened when he said my name, it was intoxicating, and it was dangerous. The next afternoon, when Ian arrived, I felt that same electric pull the moment I opened the door. He smiled, his expression warm but cautious, and I stepped aside to let him in. "Hey," I said, my voice barely steady. "Hey," he replied, his eyes meeting mine for a beat too long before he looked away. We went to the den, and Ian immediately started measuring and marking the walls, laying out the shelving plan with quiet focus. I tried to keep my distance, pretending to busy myself with rearranging books on the old shelves, but I couldn't help sneaking glances at him. The way his hands moved, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, it was impossible not to notice. At one point, he turned to me, holding up a measuring tape. "Can you hold this end for me?" "Sure," I said, crossing the room to take it. Our fingers brushed as he handed it to me, and I felt a jolt run through me, sharp and undeniable. He must have felt it too, because he froze, his eyes locking onto mine. Neither of us moved. The space between us felt impossibly small, like the whole room had closed in around us. My heart pounded, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Rachel," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, just like before. I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could do was stand there, caught in the intensity of his gaze, feeling the weight of everything we weren't saying. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. The silence between us stretched, heavy and loaded. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, a steady drumbeat that drowned out everything else. Ian's gaze didn't waver, and I couldn't look away, even though every rational part of me was screaming to step back, to put some distance between us. But I didn't move. I didn't want to. "Rachel," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was testing the weight of my name. His eyes searched mine, and I could feel the tension radiating from him, mirroring my own. My throat felt dry, and I finally managed to speak, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. "Ian, I know," he said, cutting me off gently. "I know." His words hung in the air, and for a moment I thought he might step back, give me the space I so desperately needed but didn't truly want. But instead, he stayed where he was, his presence both grounding and electrifying all at once. The measuring tape dangled between us, forgotten, and I realized my hand was still holding it. I let go, and it retracted with a soft snap, breaking the silence for a brief moment. Ian's lips twitched like he was about to say something, but he hesitated, his jaw tightening. He started, then shook his head, as if he couldn't find the right words. "You're married, Rachel. I know that." Hearing him say it felt like a cold splash of water, but it wasn't enough to extinguish the fire simmering between us. I nodded slowly, my voice trembling when I finally spoke. "I know." Another silence. This one felt different, more fragile, like we were both standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure if we'd fall or step back. Ian took a deep breath, and I could see the conflict written all over his face. "I should probably," he began, but then he stopped. His hand twitched at his side like he was fighting the urge to reach for me. "I don't want to make things harder for you." "You're not," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. My voice was quiet but firm, surprising even myself. "It's not just you, Ian. It's me too." The admission hung between us, raw and unfiltered, and I felt a surge of relief and fear all at once. I'd said it. I'd acknowledged the thing we'd both been avoiding, the thing that had been building between us since the moment he walked into my house. Ian ran a hand through his hair, his jaw working as he looked away. "This isn't fair to you," he said finally, "or to me." I wanted to agree, to tell him he was right and that we should both walk away, but I couldn't bring myself to say the words. Instead, I stepped back, creating just enough space between us to breathe. "You're right," I said softly, though the words felt like a lie. We should just focus on the shelves." Ian nodded, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, the shelves." We both knew it wasn't that simple, but neither of us said it. He turned back to his tools, his movements stiff and deliberate, and I sat down on the couch, my hands trembling in my lap. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Ian worked in near silence, his focus intense, and I kept my distance, pretending to scroll through my phone but barely registering anything on the screen. When he finally finished for the day, he packed up his tools and turned to me, his face carefully neutral. "I'll be back tomorrow to finish up," he said. "Okay," I replied, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "Thanks." He nodded, his eyes lingering on mine for just a moment, before he turned and left. The sound of the door closing felt deafening, and as I stood there in the empty den, I realized I was holding my breath. I let it out slowly, my chest tight with a mix of emotions I couldn't untangle. Guilt, desire, confusion, they all swirled together, leaving me raw and vulnerable. I knew we hadn't crossed any lines, not really, but we were close. Too close, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep walking that edge without falling. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the day over and over. The way Ian had looked at me, the hesitation in his voice, the unspoken tension that hung between us. It all felt too real, too vivid to push aside. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that we hadn't done anything wrong, but the truth was harder to ignore. I wasn't just drawn to him, I wanted him. The realization hit me like a freight train, stealing the breath from my lungs. I wanted Ian in a way I hadn't wanted anyone, not even Matt, in years. And it wasn't just about the way he looked, though that was undeniable. It was the way he made me feel, like I was seen, understood, wanted. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. The next morning, I woke up feeling raw, my emotions stretched thin. I went through my usual routine, making breakfast, getting the kids ready for school, tidying up the house, but everything felt heavier, like I was moving through quicksand. When Ian's truck pulled into the driveway, my stomach twisted into a knot. "Morning," he said, when I opened the door, his voice steady but quieter than usual. Morning, I replied, stepping aside to let him in. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but I could feel the tension radiating between us, an invisible thread pulling us closer, even as we tried to keep our distance. Ian got straight to work, his focus intense as he measured and cut the wood for the shelves. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to go over some emails, but I couldn't concentrate. Every sound he made, the scrape of the saw, the steady thud of his hammer, pulled my attention back to him. After an hour, I brought him a glass of water. It felt like a flimsy excuse to get closer to him, but I couldn't help myself. Here, I said, holding it out. He glanced up, his eyes meeting mine. Thanks, he said softly, his fingers brushing mine as he took the glass. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through me, like electricity sparking across bare wires. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. Ian looked like he wanted to speak, but he hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were holding back. Finally, he set the glass down and straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. Rachel, he said, his voice low and steady. I need to say something. My heart raced, and I nodded, bracing myself. Okay. He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. Whatever this is between us, it's not nothing. I think we both know that. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. Yeah, I admitted, my voice barely audible. I know. I don't want to cross a line, he said, his expression pained. But it's hard not to feel this. His words hit me like a tidal wave, a rush of relief and fear and longing all at once. I didn't know what to say, how to respond. All I knew was that he was right. It wasn't nothing, and I didn't want to pretend it was anymore. Ian, I started, my voice trembling. I don't know what to do. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. You don't have to do anything, he said gently. I needed to say it. For a moment, we just stood there, the space between us impossibly small. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. I wanted to reach for him to close the distance, but I was paralyzed by the weight of everything I was feeling. I should get back to work, Ian said finally, his voice tight. Yeah, I said, stepping back, my chest aching with the effort. Of course. He turned back to the shelves, and I went to the kitchen, my hands trembling as I gripped the counter. The air felt heavy, charged with everything we weren't saying, and I knew this wasn't over. We were balancing on a knife's edge, and it was only a matter of time before we fell. The hours crawled by, each second feeling stretched and weighty. Ian worked with an intensity I hadn't seen before, his movements precise and deliberate. I stayed in the kitchen, trying to focus on anything other than the knot of tension in my chest. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of him through the doorway, his brow furrowed, his hands steady, and my thoughts would spiral all over again. Around midday, I brought him a sandwich. It was a simple gesture, something I might do for anyone working in the house, but it felt like more, like an olive branch, an unspoken way of saying, I'm here, and I don't want this to break us. Thanks, he said when I handed it to him, his voice softer than before. He took it but didn't immediately eat, his gaze lingering on mine. You don't have to do this, you know. I know, I said quietly. I wanted to. That seemed to disarm him, and for a moment, the tension between us eased. He sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall as he unwrapped the sandwich. I stayed standing, unsure whether to stay or leave, but he gestured for me to sit across from him. I don't usually eat on the job, he said, smiling faintly, but I guess I can make an exception. I laughed softly, the sound surprising even me. I won't tell anyone if you don't. We sat there in silence for a while, the only sound the occasional crunch of his sandwich. It felt oddly normal, like two old friends sharing a moment of quiet in the middle of a busy day. But underneath, there was still that pull, that unspoken weight of everything we'd been avoiding. I was thinking, Ian said after a while, breaking the silence, about what I said earlier. I tensed, my heart racing. Yeah? He set the sandwich down, his expression serious. I don't regret saying it, but I know how complicated this is, for both of us. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He was right, of course. It was complicated, messy, dangerous, and yet, knowing that didn't change how I felt. I don't want to make things harder for you, he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. I wanted to be honest. Me too, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, and I don't regret it either. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had gone quiet, like there was nothing else but the two of us in that small, cluttered room. I wanted to say more, to tell him everything I'd been holding back, but the words wouldn't come. I should finish up, he said finally, breaking the spell. He stood, brushing off his hands and reaching for his tools. I stayed on the floor, watching him as he went back to work, The air between us felt lighter now, but it wasn't gone. That spark, that pull, it was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, and I knew it wasn't going to fade anytime soon. By the time he finished for the day, the shelves were nearly complete. He stood back, admiring his work, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of pride and gratitude, not just for the shelves, but for everything he'd brought into my life. His kindness, his honesty, his presence. "These are going to look amazing when they're done," he said, glancing at me. "One more day should do it." I nodded, my chest tightening. "They're perfect." "Thank you." He smiled, and for a moment I thought he might say something else. But then he just grabbed his toolbox and headed for the door. "See you tomorrow, Rachel." "See you," I said, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. As the door closed behind him, I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. Tomorrow. One more day. The thought filled me with equal parts hope and dread, because I knew that whatever happened next, there was no going back. That night, the house was quiet. The kids were asleep, their laughter and footsteps now just echoes in the stillness. Matt was in the den, his usual spot, the TV murmuring in the background as he scrolled through his phone. I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the unfinished shelves in the next room. My heart felt heavy, tangled in the weight of everything I was feeling. I thought about Ian, his voice, his hands, the way his presence filled a room without trying. And then I thought about Matt, about the life we'd built together. It wasn't a bad life. It wasn't a good one either. It was safe, predictable. And yet here I was, standing at the edge of something that threatened to unravel it all. I told myself to stop, to focus on what mattered, my family, my responsibilities. But the pull I felt toward Ian wasn't something I could ignore. It wasn't just desire. It was something deeper, something that had woken up a part of me I thought I'd lost. The next morning, I woke up early, my stomach tied in knots. Ian would be here soon, and I had no idea how I was going to face him. Part of me wanted to cancel, to tell him I'd changed my mind about the shelves and that I didn't need him to come back. But the thought of not seeing him again felt unbearable. When his truck pulled into the driveway, my heart raced. I opened the door before he could knock, and for a moment we just stood there, looking at each other. "Morning," he said, his voice soft. "Morning," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He got to work right away, his focus intense as he sanded and polished the shelves. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to organize the pantry, but my attention kept drifting to him. I couldn't help but watch the way he moved, the way his hands worked with such precision and care. It was mesmerizing, and it made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. At one point, he stepped back to admire his progress, wiping his hands on a rag. "Almost done," he said, glancing at me. "What do you think?" I walked into the den, standing beside him as I looked at the shelves. They were beautiful, sleek and polished, exactly what I'd envisioned. But it wasn't just the shelves I was thinking about. It was him. "They're perfect," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, charged with everything we weren't saying. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath catching in my throat. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice low and steady. I looked up at him, my heart pounding. His eyes searched mine, and I knew he was waiting for me to say something, to give him some kind of signal. My mind was racing, torn between everything I wanted and everything I was afraid of. "Ian, I started, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't know how to finish the sentence. He took a small step closer, his hand brushing mine. It was such a light touch, barely there, but it sent a jolt through me. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath my feet. "I don't want to make this harder for you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Before he could finish, the sound of the front door opening startled us both. I stepped back quickly, my heart racing as Matt walked into the house, his briefcase in hand. "Hey," Matt said, glancing between us. "What's going on?" "Just finishing up the shelves," Ian said smoothly, his tone professional again. "I'll be out of your hair soon." Matt nodded, clearly oblivious to the tension in the room. "Looks good," he said, gesturing toward the shelves. "Nice work." "Thanks," Ian replied, his voice steady. I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I tried to act normal, but inside, I felt like I was falling apart. Matt's presence was a harsh reminder of everything I stood to lose, and for the first time, I wondered if I'd already gone too far. Matt's unexpected presence was like a bucket of cold water. The tension that had filled the room just moments ago dissolved, replaced by a stark awareness of reality. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing as Matt walked over to inspect the shelves. "These look great," he said, running his hand along the polished wood. "Nice work." "Thank you," Ian replied, his voice calm, steady. I marveled at how effortlessly he masked whatever he might have been feeling. I wished I could do the same. I didn't realize you were still working on this, Matt said, glancing at me. Thought it was done a couple of days ago. Oh, just some finishing touches, I said quickly, my voice higher than usual. Wanted everything to be perfect. Matt nodded, satisfied with my answer. Well, it looks good. Thanks for taking care of it. No problem, Ian said, packing up his tools with efficient precision. I'll just get out of your way. Something about the way he said it, calm but firm, as if drawing a line in the sand, made my chest tighten. I wanted to say something, anything, but Matt's presence felt like a wall between us. Take care, Ian said as he walked to the door, giving me one last glance before stepping outside. It was brief, but in that look I felt everything we couldn't say: regret, longing, an unspoken goodbye. When the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Matt was already back in the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge like nothing had happened. You okay? He asked, pulling out a can of soda. Yeah, I said, forcing a smile. Just tired. He nodded, popping the tab on the can. Well, it looks great in there. Thanks for getting it done. I muttered something in response, but my mind was elsewhere. I felt like I was standing at a crossroads, and I didn't know which way to turn. Ian was gone now, and maybe that was for the best, but the ache in my chest told me it wasn't that simple. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Matt, staring at the ceiling as the weight of everything pressed down on me. The memory of Ian's touch, his voice, his eyes, it was all still so vivid, and it refused to fade. I tried to remind myself of what mattered: my family, my marriage, the life I'd built. But the truth was, I didn't know if that life was enough anymore. The next morning, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, my phone in my hand. Ian's number was still saved in my contacts, and I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to delete it, to sever the connection before it could pull me under. But another part of me, a stronger part, couldn't let go. Finally, I typed out a message. Hi, Ian. Thank you for everything. The shelves are perfect. I hesitated before sending it, my chest tight with anticipation. It wasn't much, just a simple thank you, but it felt like so much more. A few minutes later, his reply came. You're welcome. I'm glad you like them. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. It was polite, professional, just like it should have been, but the subtext lingered, heavy and unspoken. I could feel it in the silence between our words, the things we weren't saying, but couldn't ignore. For the rest of the day, I carried that message with me, replaying it in my mind. Ian was gone, the shelves were finished, and life was supposed to go back to normal, but normal didn't feel right anymore. I wasn't the same person I'd been before he walked into my kitchen, and I didn't know how to go back to the way things were. As the sun set and the house grew quiet, I realized something that scared me more than anything. I didn't want to go back. Not to the silence, the routine, the emptiness I'd been living in for so long. I wanted something more, and that terrified me. The days that followed felt like I was living in two worlds. There was the familiar rhythm of my life, packing lunches, driving the kids to school, making small talk with Matt over dinner. On the surface, everything looked normal, but inside, I felt like a stranger in my own skin, caught between who I was supposed to be and the person Ian had awakened in me. I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into chores and errands, but nothing worked. Every time I walked into the den, the sight of those perfect shelves brought everything rushing back, the weight of his gaze, the unspoken tension between us, the way his presence had filled the room. It was like a phantom, lingering in every corner of my mind. One afternoon, a week after Ian had finished the shelves, I found myself sitting in the den, staring at my phone again. His number was still there, a silent reminder of everything I was trying to forget. I told myself I shouldn't text him, that it was over, and I needed to let it go, but the pull was too strong, the ache too deep. Before I could stop myself, I typed out a message. Hi, Ian. Just wanted to say the shelves have been getting a lot of compliments. You really did an amazing job. I hit send and immediately regretted it. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, waiting for a reply that I wasn't sure I even wanted. A few minutes passed, and then my phone buzzed. Thanks, Rachel. That means a lot. Glad they're working out for you. His response was polite, nothing more, but it still made my chest tighten. I stared at the message, torn between relief and disappointment. I should have let it end there, but I couldn't help myself. How have you been? I typed, hesitating before pressing send. It was a simple question, but it felt loaded, like I was opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. His reply came quickly. I've been good, keeping busy. You? Same. I wrote back. Things are fine. Just the usual. For a moment, I thought that would be the end of it, but then another message came through. I miss talking to you. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The words felt like a confession, raw and unfiltered, and they hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, my mind racing. I knew I shouldn't respond, that acknowledging it would only make things harder, but the truth was, I missed him too. I miss you too, I typed, my hands trembling as I hit send. The silence that followed felt unbearable. I stared at the screen, waiting for his reply, my heart pounding in my chest. When it finally came, my stomach twisted. I don't know what to do about this, Rachel, he wrote, but I can't stop thinking about you. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. His words were everything I'd been feeling, everything I'd been afraid to admit to myself. I knew we were crossing a line, stepping into dangerous territory, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. I can't stop thinking about you either, I replied, the weight of my confession settling over me like a storm cloud. For the rest of the night, I couldn't focus on anything else. My phone stayed in my hand, every buzz making my heart jump. Ian and I kept texting, our words careful but heavy with emotion. Neither of us said anything explicit, but the undercurrent was impossible to ignore. We both knew where this was heading, even if we didn't say it out loud. When I finally went to bed, Matt was already asleep, his back turned to me. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I knew I was playing with fire, that I was risking everything, but the thought of letting Ian go felt unbearable, like I'd be losing a part of myself I'd only just rediscovered. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized something that scared me more than anything. I wasn't just drawn to Ian, I was falling for him, and I didn't know how to stop. The next morning, I woke up with a weight in my chest that I couldn't shake. My conversation with Ian the night before played on a loop in my mind, every word a mix of longing and guilt. I knew I should feel ashamed. I was a wife, a mother, someone who was supposed to hold it all together. But the truth was, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt alive. Matt left early for work, kissing me on the cheek in his usual distracted way. The kids were in the middle of their morning chaos, racing around the house as I packed their lunches. Life moved on around me, oblivious to the storm brewing inside. I dropped the kids off at school and found myself driving aimlessly, my thoughts too scattered to head straight home. Eventually, I parked at a quiet coffee shop and stared at my phone. Ian's messages from the night before still open on the screen. I wanted to text him, to hear from him, to feel that connection again, but I didn't know what to say. Instead, I sat there, sipping my coffee and replaying everything in my mind. His voice, his touch, the way he made me feel like I wasn't invisible. By the time I got home, I felt more restless than ever. I wandered into the den, running my fingers along the shelves Ian had built. They were perfect, a testament to his skill and care, and they reminded me of him in a way that made my chest ache. I sat down on the couch, staring at the empty room, and before I knew it, I was typing out a message. "Hi, Ian. Are you free to talk?" His reply came quickly. "Yeah. Everything okay?" "I don't know," I wrote back. "Can you come over?" The seconds stretched into eternity as I waited for his response. When it finally came, my heart skipped a beat. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. I paced the house, my nerves frayed, my mind racing. I didn't know what I was going to say to him, what I wanted from him. All I knew was that I needed to see him, to figure out what this was and what it meant. When his truck pulled into the driveway, my pulse quickened, and I opened the door before he could knock. "Hey," he said softly, his eyes searching mine as he stepped inside. "Hey," I replied, closing the door behind him. My hands were trembling, and I crossed my arms to steady them. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us heavy with everything we weren't saying. Finally, Ian spoke. "Rachel, if this is too much, if you want me to leave, I will. Just say the word." I shook my head, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want you to leave." His eyes softened, and he stepped closer, his movements careful, like he didn't want to startle me. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and steady. I swallowed hard, my chest tight with emotion. "I don't know," I admitted. I feel like I've been asleep for years, and you woke me up, and now I don't know how to go back." Ian reached for my hand, his touch warm and grounding. "You don't have to go back," he said quietly. "You deserve to feel alive, Rachel, to feel seen." Tears welled in my eyes, and I looked away, overwhelmed by the weight of his words. "But what about everything else? My family, my life?" He squeezed my hand gently, his voice firm but kind. "I'm not here to tell you what to do. I just know how I feel, and I know I can't ignore it anymore." I looked up at him then, my heart pounding. His eyes were steady, full of longing and understanding, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe. Slowly, hesitantly, I stepped closer, closing the space between us. He didn't move, didn't push, just waited for me to decide. When our lips met, it was like the world fell away. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but it quickly deepened, years of unspoken need spilling over. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I let myself sink into the moment, into him. It felt like coming home and starting over all at once. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, Ian rested his forehead against mine. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I know," I said, my voice shaking. "I know." In that moment, I wasn't thinking about the consequences or what came next. All I knew was that I couldn't let this feeling slip away. Not yet. For the first time in years, I felt alive. And for now, that was enough.